Hey y'all, it's Professor Marinos, and today we're going to start in on one of my very favorite topics, nutrient biogeochemistry. I'm a nutrient biogeochemist, so this is my home turf. And previously in this class, we've been considering things that happen on more geologic timescales, things like weathering of silica and aluminum, redox reactions, things like that. But now we're going to zoom in on reactions that are occurring and are relevant on biological timescales. So the timescales that occur over the course of a single organism's life, whether that organism lives, 5 days or 50 years. And we're going to specifically focus on the elements that are essential to life. We call these nutrients. These are elements that we organisms must assimilate into our bodies in order to build tissues and grow and reproduce, which is the ultimate goal of all life, is to grow and reproduce. And particularly we're going to look at this through the lens of nitrogen and phosphorus. Why nitrogen and phosphorus? Nitrogen and phosphorus are some of the elements that we require in the greatest quantities. I speak of we as all life, not just humans, but humans certainly as well. Nitrogen and phosphorus we require a lot of, and they can be relatively scarce in the environment. And so our high demand coupled with low supply makes the cycling of these elements very important for life and also very interesting. So let's just jump into it. By the end of this module, I want you to be able to summarize the major processes that control the cycling of nitrogen and phosphorus on land, summarize why different elements are limiting in different ecosystem types, for instance, terrestrial, freshwater, and marine environments, and describe two important environmental problems that result from nutrient excesses in ecosystems. So those are the entire module learning objectives. By the end of this video, I want you to be able to recap 2 reasons why organisms modify the chemistry of the Earth's surface, explain the principle of limiting nutrients, and describe 2 environmental problems that are as the result of excess nutrients. So just to review something that we discussed in the very beginning of the class, most organisms, plants, animals, fungi, a lot of bacteria and archaea as well, get energy from the environment via aerobic energetics. And this is the combination of organic carbon with oxygen in a respiration reaction to produce CO2 and water. In the case of plants, they fix their own carbon. They make sugars from photosynthesis that they then respire with oxygen to gain energy. So it's the same reaction, except they're just kind of self-reliant on their own carbon, organic carbon, whereas microbes scavenge carbon from the environment, and so do animals. Animals, fungi, bacteria, they scavenge carbon from the environment, combine it with oxygen, and gain energy through the respiration of carbon dioxide. Now, just to consider these other reactions, they're also anaerobic energetics, and these are all governed by the redox processes that we discussed in the last unit. So these should be relatively familiar to you, and you should now know why you have the production of these forms of these elements given the inputs of these elements. These are all just redox processes that we talked about previously. And again, this relies on the combination of organic carbon with all these elements, or for a single microbe, one of these elements combined with organic carbon to produce these products, such that microbes can gain energy through anaerobic metabolism. So this is, again, the first principle of why organisms transform elements in the environments. It's organismal energetics. Now, let's just rehash organismal stoichiometry again, too. Humans are made up of fixed elements. We are, 65% oxygen, 18% carbon, 10% hydrogen, 3% nitrogen, et cetera, et cetera. And here's the full list. And we can't grow unless we acquire all of these elements in the ratios that we need to comprise our tissues. There's no such thing as a human being that has no magnesium in their body. And similarly, all organisms obey these same sorts of stoichiometric rules. So plants, this tree, for instance, shown in this paper from Zhang et al., this is a forest in China, has specific stoichiometric ratios in each of their tissues. And so leaves have a carbon to nitrogen to phosphorus ratio of 447 to 19 to 1. And if this tree can't acquire nitrogen in sufficient quantities to maintain this ratio in its leaves, then its leaves can't grow. It's deficient in nitrogen. Similarly for phosphorus. So both nitrogen and phosphorus exert a primary control on the rate of growth in forests because these elements are needed in large quantities to grow the tissues that comprise a tree. Now, these ratios change as you move through different organs of the tree. You know, the trunk is a lot woodier, has a lot less nitrogen and phosphorus in it. It's mostly cellulose, which is just carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. So, you know, these elemental ratios vary as you consider different organs of the tree, just like they vary in a human as you consider different organs of a human. But it all sums up to a overall stoichiometric ratio that must be maintained by a tree or a plant to grow. Similarly, microbes have a stoichiometric ratio that they must obey as well. And this is a very, very famous ratio discovered by a man, Arthur Redfield. Arthur Redfield just cruised around on a boat all around the world in the 1950s, carefree, taking samples of water, extracting the organisms from them. And what he discovered was pretty shocking at the time. He discovered that no matter where in the world he was, and no matter what the nutrient contents of the water were, in terms of how much nitrogen and phosphorus were just floating around free in the water, all of the organisms that he filtered out had this very fixed ratio, which he called the Redfield ratio. He didn't call it that. Somebody else called it that later. He's not an egomaniac or anything. But this ratio is 106 carbon to 16 nitrogen to 1 phosphorus. And this is a widely obeyed ratio in marine waters all across the world. And so not only do plants obey organismal stoichiometry, but microbes and everything else obeys organismal stoichiometry. Everything has to acquire elements in relatively fixed ratios in order to grow and reproduce, which is the ultimate goal of all life, again. And so this principle of organismal stoichiometry leads us to the concept of a limiting nutrient. And a limiting nutrient is the nutrient for an organism that is in shortest supply relative to the demand by biota. And this limiting nutrient will constrain the growth and reproduction of organisms. This was first conceptualized by a German, Justus von Liebig, back in the 1800s, which he visualized this as a barrel with staves of different lengths. And his analogy was that you can only fill up a barrel to the height of the shortest stave. And so to take this metaphor and to put it into terms of nutrients, if you visualize each of these staves as a nutrient that a plant needs in some ratio, or any organism needs in some ratio, the growth of that organism, or the filling of the barrel, will only proceed to the most limiting nutrient, or the shortest stave. So in this example here, I've put nitrogen as the limiting organism. And if you alleviate nitrogen limitation by increasing the supply of nitrogen, say through fertilization, you will increase growth only to the next most limiting nutrient, which I put here as phosphorus. So it's always the nutrient that is most scarce relative to demand that constrains the growth of biota. This is the concept of a limiting nutrient. Okay, so now that you understand the principle of a limiting nutrient, I want to talk a little bit about what happens in the absence of a limiting nutrient, how things can go haywire when nutrients are in abundance. And the first example that I want to talk about is one that you probably are familiar with in Buffalo. That's of harmful algal blooms. Harmful algal blooms are a huge problem in Lake Erie, particularly in the western basin, but to a limited extent in the eastern basin towards Buffalo. But these harmful algal blooms are a result of way too many nutrients entering into Lake Erie. And they support these giant algal blooms of algae called microcystis. And microcystis are these algae that produce a potent liver toxin called microcystin that just wreaks havoc in municipal water supplies. Like municipalities will have to shut down their water supplies for days and weeks when you have an algal bloom like this, because this potent toxin will otherwise poison the residents if they don't shut off the water. So these are a major problem in a lot of freshwater bodies, particularly ones that border agricultural areas, but not exclusively. You know, if you go down to downtown Buffalo into Delaware Park, there's a giant lake there, and that lake has signs plastered all over it saying, like, microcystis blooms have been observed here. Don't eat the fish. And that's very good advice. I would not eat the fish. Those blooms are mostly due to sewage entering that lake. But there are, the nutrients can come from either agriculture or sewage or a variety of other sources. But those are the two big ones. So yeah, algal bloom in Lake Erie. This is it viewed from space. So you can see up here, here's Detroit. Here is Toledo area. Over here is Cleveland, and this whole light green area that you see here is a giant algal bloom that happened in 2002. And this was from runoff from agricultural fields from southwestern Ontario and from Ohio, to a limited extent Indiana, just flooding into the lake. And when the waters got warm, these algae could really grow really well, and they caused these huge, disgusting algal blooms that caused major water quality issues all across the Lake Erie Basin. Now, so why does this happen? Well, like I said, this is driven by microcystis. This is microcystis aeruginosa pictured here. And these are just these tiny single-celled algae that respond a lot to phosphorus inputs. When there's a big flood of phosphorus into a lake, these algae really get into the condition where they can grow very, very well. They're not as responsive to nitrogen. We'll get into the reasons why for that in a later lecture. But these microcystis are very, very responsive to phosphorus. And most of that phosphorus, at least in Lake Erie, like I said, comes out of agricultural fields. So farmers will drain their fields through these channels, which efficiently drain water off their land, which is good for crops, so your feet don't get wet when you're growing. Roots don't like being saturated. But these drainage ditches are very, very effective conduits for phosphorus into Lake Erie. And when you have a big rainstorm, you'll wash a ton of phosphorus into the lake, and you'll get algal problems. And so these things are constantly monitored. There's a constant monitoring effort to check how much phosphorus is going into Lake Erie and to try and meet reduction targets so that these algal blooms don't become a problem in the future. It's a very hairy and intractable problem and a very expensive problem to deal with, though. And so we've been really struggling to deal with them. So the second consequence of excess nutrients in a landscape that I want to talk about is coastal dead zones, which you've probably heard of, or otherwise called an oxygen minimum zone in the ocean. And here you can see a map from summer 2002, where yellow and green indicates high oxygen content at the bottom of the ocean, and red indicates very, very low oxygen content. And you can see all along the coast of Texas, Louisiana, and this extends into Alabama, although it's not shown. You have this deep lack of oxygen all across the coastal area. And this is super important because this lack of oxygen kills a lot of stuff. It kills fish that live at the bottom of the ocean. It kills shrimp. It kills crabs. It kills a lot of very, very tasty crustaceans that are super important for the economies of these areas. So this can cause major damage to fisheries, and that's why this is a huge concern all along the Gulf Coast, huge concern in Europe, huge concern in China. These dead zones can really wreak havoc on the economies of coastal communities. Now, why do these dead zones happen? Why is there a lack of oxygen in these coastal oceans? Well, I can explain it to you with a little cartoon. Coming out of the mouth of the Mississippi, there is tons of nitrogen that enters the Gulf of Mexico, and that is the ultimate driver of these dead zones. You have nitrogen fertilizer that's applied in fields in Minnesota and Iowa and Ohio, and that nitrogen fertilizer comes down the Mississippi and just flows into the Gulf of Mexico, where there are lots of organisms that are just waiting for some nitrogen to grow and reproduce, these algae, which I've shown as green blobs. And so these algae are living high on the hog. They're getting a lot of nitrogen out of the Mississippi. They're growing and reproducing very, very, very well. And so you have large algal blooms in the ocean. But death comes for us all. And eventually these algae die. And when they die, their corpses sink to the bottom of the ocean. Now, why is this a problem? You have all these algal corpses at the bottom of the ocean. Well, you have heterotrophic microbes, such as Mr. Pac-Man right here, who wants to come and eat these algae to gain energy that's stored in this dead algal tissue. So heterotrophic microbes come along and eat the remains of the algae that's sunk down from the top of the ocean to the bottom of the ocean. And in eating these algae, this microbe, of course, consumes oxygen and respires carbon dioxide. And this consumption of oxygen is what drives these dead zones. So the death of algae, followed by the respiration of the carbon that's stored in these algal tissues, is what drives the drawdown of oxygen and the production of carbon dioxide in these environments. And this drawdown of oxygen, like I said, results in major fish kills and deaths of other organisms that rely on this oxygen to live. So this, like I said, is primarily driven by nitrogen, and you'll notice that I said that the blooms in lakes are driven by phosphorus, whereas these marine blooms are driven by nitrogen. Why does that happen? We're going to get to that question in a little bit. We're going to discuss why marine systems tend to have blooms induced by nitrogen fertilization, whereas freshwater systems have blooms that are induced by phosphorus fertilization. But we'll leave that question until later. But I just want to leave you with one further definition, and that definition is of the word eutrophication. And eutrophication is the state of intense growth of organisms because they're no longer constrained by any limiting nutrients. And so eutrophication is what's happening in both the lake and the marine examples. You have photosynthetic organisms just growing like crazy because they have an abundance of nitrogen and phosphorus, and they're only limited by the rate at which they can photosynthesize, which can be high in the lack of nutrient limitation. And so we call this a eutrophic state. And the process of changing from a slow-growing or an oligotrophic state to a very fast-growing state is the eutrophication of a water body. So that's all I have for you today. Next time we're going to dig a bit more into the nitrogen cycle on land and find out what leads to nitrogen being lost into freshwater bodies.